We are now going to set the sleeves in. Before you do anything, what you need to check for is that you've got these notches marked from the pattern piece onto your garment. If you don't already, what you need to do is get your pattern piece and firstly line it up. I know we've already sewed this together, so it might be a little bit tricky, but open your seam allowance out so that you get it in exactly the right place, and line it up with the pattern piece here. It's trickier than it sounded. I did it before on my ironing board, now it's harder here. There we go. So line this up and check that it all lines up to exactly the same shape as the pattern piece still, and then mark this notch with a pin. Do not use a clip, use a pin, because pins are really precise. I know clips are really fantastic for lots of stuff, but pins are really important for this specific thing. And then exactly the same on the underarm. Open your seam allowance out and make sure you get a pin in exactly the right place, and just check it all and make sure that is in the right place. Now I've put my pin through several times because I do not want to lose this. This is really important. So that's the markings that you'll need. The next thing is to work out which is your left sleeve and which is your right. Now these pins mark the center, here we go, center top and center bottom or underarm of the sleeve. They are not, if you fold this, you'll see, you can't just fold the sleeve in half to find these, because the sleeve is not symmetrical, and that's so that we get a really good shape as it comes out of the armhole, and it fits really nicely, because this is a set-in coat sleeve, which is different, for example, to a sleeve you might get on a jumper or a cardigan. So it's a really precisely fitting sleeve, so don't just fold it in half. Do make sure you get the markings off the actual pattern piece, and then keep these in so that you've got them. Then you want to find which is your left sleeve and which is your right sleeve. Now if you fold the sleeve roughly where the pins are, so you get an approximate, this is what the sleeve looks like, you'll find on one side you've got a seam line running down there, but then on the other side the seam line isn't all the way until quite close to the edge. So the way you can tell is because the side of the sleeve that has kind of the most section of the oversleeve without a seam is the front of the sleeve, and then when you turn it over, the back of the sleeve, as you're wearing it on the garment, as in the part that will be facing towards, kind of towards your back versus towards your front, has the seam almost halfway. It's not quite halfway, but it's almost halfway through the sleeve. So looking at this, if I was facing down onto my table, this would be the back of my sleeve, that would be my left, and that would be my right. Hopefully that makes sense. If it doesn't, please comment below the video and we will help you. But what you're looking for is that the seam is in the center, roughly center back of the sleeve when you fold it roughly in line with where the pins are. So to insert the sleeve so that you can see where it's going to go, I'm going to put my garment down in the middle here, and you can kind of, as we can't get too zoomed out, but this is the back of my garment here, and you can see this sleeve with its seam is going to be running on the left, and this one with its seam is going to be running on the right. And if I turned the garment over, I would need to swap my sleeves to the other side, and looking at the front here, so I'll just do one so you can see. That's the center back, that's my neck hole, that's my armhole, and this sleeve is going to join in here, and there's not any seam here. The seam that you can see is right at the very bottom, right into my underarm there, and we're going to attach them. So what I would recommend you do is just get one sleeve, put the other sleeve aside. So I'm going to get rid of mine there, and I'm going to use this one here. So make sure you've lay your garment out and check that you've got the correct sleeve on the correct armhole. If you put the wrong sleeve on the wrong armhole, like the left onto the right, you will find that it does not fit very well. It will pull and it will twist and it will feel very uncomfortable to wear. Now, what we want is the garment wrong side out and the sleeve right side out. So I've already turned mine right side out, and you will too, in order to work out which one's which. So now I want to turn my garment right side out. I'm just going to go through here and I'm going to grab this sleeve here so that I don't want to move it all around and then get lost which is the right sleeve for which armhole. So I'm just going to use this here, and I'm going to take, this is my, move this up so you can see it. This here is my front, this is my side front, this is my side back, and that is my back. And I'm going to take this pin that we had for the direct underarm, and I'm going to pin it to the side seam, and I'm going to pin it directly there. Now you will notice that this seam here, which is in between the oversleeve and the undersleeve, does not line up with this seam here. We're lining up the pins, we're not lining up the seams. And then I'm going to take the pin that we had from the top, and I'm going to pin that to the what's this called? The shoulder seam. That's it. So there is our sleeve. Now, the next thing you'll notice, we've got it attached, we're happy with that, is that the sleeve looks bigger than the armhole. That is correct. This is a set-in sleeve. It is not the same as a jumper or a cardigan sleeve, where the sleeve is almost exactly the same size as the armhole. You have to ease this in slightly. Now, if you are using a fabric which does not have any give or stretch at all, what you might need to do, if you find this next method quite difficult, is to go back and using a long loose stitch a couple of lines of gathering or basting stitches so that you can pull at them a little bit and just gather this up ever so slightly, not so much that you make folds in the fabric, but just so that it kind of comes together more and you can ease it into the sleeve as we're doing the next step. So that's a little trick if you find this next bit hard. But what we're going to do first is I'm going to use pins only. I'm not going to use clips here, and I'm going to start from the underarm here. And the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to pin, keeping the sleeve flat against the armhole. I'm going to pin both of these seam allowances of my sleeve here. The words sleeve here open because I want to keep my seam allowances open, remember. So this might seem like pin overload, but this is how I know, and I'm going to stitch this really carefully, and this is how I know I'm not going to accidentally stitch through that with that folded over and make too much bulk. Now there is a video that you'll find linked into the tutorial to our Kingston jacket, which is a slightly different jacket, but it gives exactly the same technique of what I'm going to use here. So if you need another view or another kind of different angle, different wording, go watch that one as well, because that will, I think it's a really great one to show you. And what I'm doing here is I am pinning the sleeve to the armhole in the underarm part of the sleeve only. I'm not coming all the way up onto the top here. I'm just holding them together. I'm not stretching one or the other. I'm not easing them. I'm just doing it along the part that we don't need to ease first, so that we get kind of this straight bit out of the way. So if you look at my armhole, I've pinned from roughly half to roughly half. Kind of halfway down the front of your arm. I've not pinned this top bit because this is where excuse me, this is where we're going to be easing. So this next bit is the tricky bit. So you've got this kind of flap of fabric from your sleeve, and yet you've got a relatively straight part of the armhole. But this is where, when the sleeve is set in nicely, you have your shoulder, and then you have this really nice puff of the sleeve coming out. And you don't need shoulder pads to achieve that. You can have them, but you can also do it by this, and this is a really beautiful way of having a gorgeous garment. So what I'm doing here is I've got my my coat here, and I've got my sleeve here, and what I want to do is kind of take halfway so that it's roughly halfway, and I'm placing my thumbs in the middle here, and I'm lining up the raw edges so that they are, one is not longer than the other, like that is not aligned, that is aligned. I want the raw edges to be the same length, but I'm not actually interested in them being flat together like they are here. What's going to happen is my sleeve is going to be kind of crinkled at the edge. They're still going to be the same length, the seam allowances, but my sleeve will be crinkled at the edge, but both will be flat along roughly 1/2 inch in from the edge. So I really find this difficult to explain. So I'm going to halve and then halve again in order to do this. So I'm going to take roughly half here with my fingers and roughly half from the other side, and then I want to align the raw edges so that they're the same length. I'm not interested in them sitting flat, I just want them to be the same length, and then I'm going to use a pin, and this is part of why pinning is so helpful. I haven't quite got there halfway. This is harder to talk and do it on camera than it is to do it off camera. There we go. So now I go to my next kind of half, and you can see this bit here is still shorter than this bit. So I'm going to take roughly half again, and it helps to kind of press it in on a curve, or you might find, depending on which way your fabric has a little bit of give, you might want to press it this way. I usually find it's easier to have the longer side kind of underneath, and I sort of curve it as I do it in order to get it really really smooth. And if you're finding this is too much to ease, what you can do is go back and unpin 1 or 2 of these so that you can get yourself a bit more kind of garment to work with. And this is one of the reasons why this can be a bit of a tricky coat. So I've got that half in, and then I want to do this half again, and curving it really helps. And when you sew it, you can curve it again as well to kind of keep it really flat. Now if you can see this here, where I've got my thumb, this is flat here. There's no bubbles along this. If you look here, it's taut on the other side, but it's not stretched, and there are absolutely no bubbles here. But if I was to keep this straight, can you see how there's bubbles at the raw edge? The raw edges are the same length, but they're not aligning, and that's because this is curved and that is more straight. So I am only interested in it being flat along here, which is roughly 1/2 inch in, which is where I'm going to be stitching. I don't care about this bit, this is all in the seam allowance, but if I get it flat along here, when I turn that through, that is going to be really super pretty. It's going to puff up really nicely, and so I'm going to do the same thing over this side. Half, I'm going to pin, half until I get it really nice and flat, and then the same with the other side. So I'm going to do that, and then I'll come back and show you. So here is my pinned sleeve head. You can see I've pinned absolutely tons, and that it's all around the top half of the sleeve, not so much on the bottom half. And you can see here it is completely flat along there. It took a little bit of wiggling. I had to unpin some pins and then pin some back in. It's one of the slowest parts of the whole coat, getting this pinned in right. But if I hold this so that it's straight, you can see that my coat is flat and my sleeve is wavy at the edge. It is only flat just along here, which is roughly 1/2 inch in. Now when I'm going to stitch this, I'm going to do a couple of things, and I don't know I can get the camera so that you can see it on my sewing machine, but I'm going to feed it in this way. I'm going to start at the underarm. I know there's a lot of pins here, but they're just holding seam allowances. This is where it's all nice and flat. So I'm going to start my stitching somewhere along here. I'm going to feed it in my machine like that, and I will have, so you can see I've got my sleeve on the top and my coat on the bottom. This is important because as I feed it through my sewing machine, I am going to hold this quite taut. I'm not going to stretch it. If there's any give in your garment, do not stretch. Just keep it as taut as you can. And then as I sew it, I'm going to use my other hand to curve this upwards, because what this does is it forces the garment, it forces the fabric to curve along this part here, which is the flat bit. Ignore this edge. We're looking here 1/2 inch in, and I'm going to curve it, and I'll use my thumb as I sew it to keep this curved upwards. Can you see this is curved up towards the camera? How do I show you that? So I'm holding it like that as it's going through, curving it upwards, and I'm going to sew it like that. And that way this gets as flat as it can. Now, a couple of tips. If you finish it and you're like, oh my God, it's amazing, I did it finally, or thank God that bit's over, whatever you're thinking about it, when you undo it, if you find, when you take it off your machine, if you find there are any little, like let's say you didn't quite keep it flat and there's a little tuck like that, that doesn't look great on the outside. What I would suggest you do there is just unpick from here to here around the tuck. You don't need to unpick your whole sleeve head. You can just get your unpicker and just unpick that in a couple of stitches either way, and then kind of stretch it or keep it taut and then stitch it again. Another benefit of having the sleeve on the top and the garment on the bottom is that you're likely to see this, because this is the bit that's likely to get little tucks and pinches because it is the bigger part of the garment as you're stitching it on. So hopefully you'll catch these as you get to them. Don't worry if you see one happening, just come back to it later, unpick just that little bit and then stitch that bit again. Now, here is a sleeve I prepared earlier. This one's on the other side. I've already stitched this and I want to show you here. You can see exactly the same thing, that it's still wavy on one side and straight on the other, and the seam allowances don't want to sit together, and that's totally fine. They do match lengthwise at the raw edge, but they will never match widthwise at the raw edge because this bit is wider, the sleeve is wider than the coat. So if I turn this through, and you can see this, and I haven't pressed this yet, but you can see there are no tucks or pinches around the edge there, and even without me having pressed it yet, you can see the sleeve kind of puffs outwards, and this is what I was talking about, is this puff. So you have a beautifully tailored flat coat with this kind of puff coming out. I'm sure there's a technical word for that. Would somebody please link me it underneath? Tell me what it is in the comments. I don't know, but I call it a little puff, comes out of there, and that's like you see on tailored suit jackets. So then you get that really nice set in sleeve look. Now, when you're pressing it, which is the last little bit of the puzzle, ideally you want to press the seam allowance open so that it's like that on the inside. This is really hard, especially on kids. But one of the things I recommend is if you have one of those big tailor's hams, which is like a really hard kind of smooth rock thing, to pop it underneath, let's pretend that is one, pop it underneath, and when you iron it, you're then ironing it on the curve. So you're keeping the puff as you iron it, rather than if you put it on a like a flat surface, you're going to just crush it as you iron that down. And especially if you use any steam, that might contract in and you'll lose the puff. So if you don't have a tailor's ham, an alternative is get a really good kind of tea towel or towel and roll it up really tight and into a like a ball like that. So you've got your thing, and then turn it, roll it like that, oh my goodness, my words, and then fold this around so that it's like that, and it's really tight, and then you can stick that underneath, and then you can use that there. It's really hard to iron this. You're going to be doing it in like tip of the iron a little bit, tip of the iron a little bit, like that. And I am only interested when I'm ironing a sleeve head, and technically this is probably not that great. You should really iron all the way around, but shh, don't tell anyone. I tend to iron from about halfway around my sleeve head to the other half, because frankly, whenever I'm going to stick my arms into the air to do something, the likelihood of someone going, you didn't iron under your arm, is pretty slim, and I don't want to wreck a really nice coat that I'm halfway through making by getting a great big iron burn mark because I was trying too hard to get underneath and I couldn't reach it. So definitely iron the top, because you want to have that really nice smooth edge. So that's about the last thing I could say about this is, if you struggle to do this and you're just like, Rebecca, this is insane, why would you give us such a hard sleeve head? The answer is, of course, because it looks beautiful when it's done. But if you are really struggling with it, there's a couple of things you could do to help. One thing you could do is hand baste all of this first so that you get it really flat, and then and if you hand baste slightly into the seam allowance, so You're going to stitch at 1/2 inch, so do it at like 3/8 or 1/4. That way it's all held together nicely. And then you could do it again as long as your your fabric doesn't have holes left in it by pins. You could do it again maybe 3/4 of an inch in, so that you've got basting either side for you to then stitch between. That kind of holds it really steady for you to get this easily. And when you're hand basting, I get my thread and I just go in and out, in and out, in and out, in and out. I'm just doing it really loosely to hold the fabric together, because then when I've stitched the actual seam, then you just pull the basting thread out and it doesn't remain in the garment. You don't see it in the final garment. I would not do that on my leather one. My faux leather one I'm about to do. That one I will do like this, except it's going to be a bit trickier, because if I put pins into it, it's going to mark the garment. So what I'm going to do with that one instead is I'm going to use clips, and I will probably line the clips up all the way around. It's going to be literally a whole sleeve head full of clips, so that I can get it as smooth as possible. Another way you can do is, as I said before, do gathering stitches just around the top half of the sleeve head, and then as you're doing this process of pinning it all, just pull the gathering stitches ever so slightly, not so that it goes and gathers right up, but just so that it just does that, and it just helps you then get this curve smooth all the way around. Now I think that's it. If anyone else has any other tips for how you do this, please comment below the videos, because this is it's a fantastic technique to learn how to do, but it is the one little kind of tricky-ish part of it if you're not used to doing kind of more formal set-in sleeves. But it's really awesome. It looks fantastic. So show us your sleeve heads once you've done it. Post pictures of them so that we can all see and applaud you and go, yay! So good luck. I'll see you in a moment. One of the things I really like to do is to stitch a second time inside the seam allowance of my armhole seam. So this was my original stitching here, and then I've stitched again over here, which is about kind of 1/8 of an inch to just under 1/4 of an inch. And I've just stitched all the way around roughly there. And what that does is the armhole is one of the most stressed parts of the garment. So as you're moving your arm, the seam here gets twisted, pulled slightly, you reach over for something, and it just gets a lot of stress. And that's why in ready-to-wear garments it's one of the first seams that often pops open or rips, where you see people when they've stretched forward and suddenly their sleeve is separated. So I like to stitch in the seam allowance. If you do that, when you press your seam, you want to press the seam allowance out towards the sleeve so it gets hidden in that kind of puff that we've just created. If you're not going to do that, then you can press your seam allowance open, but otherwise press it towards the sleeve. We are now up to the collar. Now you'll need 2 pieces for this. Your top and under collar, which is the bit that goes on the top that kind of curves over while you're wearing it, and the collar band. This is the bit that is right next to your neck, so they will eventually sit like that together, and this will be your garment down here, and that will be your head up here. So that's how they sit, and then this bit gets folded over when you're wearing it. So it's a 2-piece collar. You'll see on here there are lots of little stitch lines. This is a little feature that we love doing, is lots of little horizontal lines along the collar band. I'll show you that when we get to it, but it is completely optional, and if you don't like that look, you don't have to do it. Something super cool I have seen some people do though is embroider on the underside of their collar here or their collar band. Like put their name along here, or like, you know, pretty swirls or skulls one person did. There's like so many cool things you could do if you're into embroidery, because this is a kind of a bit of the trench that you don't see on a day-to-day basis, but you kind of get a little sneak peek of every now and again. So we're going to use these. You can optionally interface. I am not going to interface my black one that I'm doing, but I am interfacing because it's already quite stiff, and the interfacing doesn't stick that well to it. So what I have done is I've interfaced one of my top collar and one of my collar band. So you can see that's there. And with the interfacing, I have, for this one, just used the whole size of the pattern piece. I've cut out one whole bit of my fabric, one whole bit of my interfacing, and then I've ironed it on. What you can do though, if your fabric is quite thick and you want to reduce some bulk, is cut them out and then trim about 1/4 of an inch off all the way around your interfacing, so that, and then when you iron it on, align it so that it sits right in the middle, and then that way it will go slightly into your seam allowance, so it will get caught and it will stay there when you're wearing the garment, but it won't take up quite as much bulk. Now for this, this fabric is really floppy, and I want my collar to sit up a little bit, so I've used quite a thick interfacing. Most fabrics you'll find you only need a medium interfacing. I could, this is my other collar piece, I could interface this one as well, but when you're wearing it, usually what you do is put the layer so that the interfaced one ends up underneath, so you're wearing it like that, and then the one that's not interfaced sits on top as you're wearing it. So as this is curving around your neck, you get a really nice soft piece of fabric next to your neck. If you do it the other way around, two things happen. If you put your interfaced one next to your neck, firstly, this is kind of stiff, sat next to your neck, and secondly, if you can see underneath, see how this one's just flopped? So it gets a little bit kind of baggy underneath, whereas with the interfaced one, that is the one that goes not next to your body, but the one that is aligned with the back of the garment, it provides support for the non-interfaced one to sit on. So that's why we do it that way. Anyway, let's get going with this. So what you're going to need is your two top collars, and place them right side together. And what we are going to do first off is we are going to stitch up one side, around the corner, along the top, and down the other side. Leave this bottom curved piece open, and then once you've done that, we're going to clip it and turn it through. So I have stitched around using my 1/2 inch seam allowance, and then what we need to do is to trim and clip the seam allowance, because this around here, this curve will create a whole lot of bulk when we turn it through. So what I've done is I've used pinking shears around the curve, and then I've just trimmed the seam allowance straight across the top. You could also just trim it and then snip into it about 3/4 of the way into the seam allowance, not up to the actual seam. And then we want to turn it through where the magic happens, and you only see a nice outside bit. And then see how this is, because one part is interfaced and one part is not, I'm going to have to press this and roll this so that it is exactly on the edge like that. So I'm going to use that same rolling technique that we talked about before when I'm pressing it, to get that nice and aligned properly. So I've now turned it inside out, I've pressed it, and the other thing I've done is I've top stitched all the way around using somewhere between 1/4 and 1/8 of an inch seam allowance, all the way around from one side along the top and down to the bottom. This bottom section here is still open. And then the next thing we're going to do is attach our collar stand. So here is my collar stand. I'll try and squish that in so you can see the whole thing. So this is the long bottom edge that's going to attach to the actual garment, and this is the slightly shorter curved inwards, is that convex, concave, I can never remember, like that anyway, edge that is going to attach to the actual collar. So I'm using my interfaced one here, so if you're interfacing one of them, grab your interfaced one, and then I've got my actual collar piece here, and I want to check which is the interfaced one, and it is this one here. So I'm going to place that right side up as well, and I'm just putting them one on top of the other, because this is how they're going to be in the finished garment. Collar stand, collar, and then I'm going to flip this down, because what we want to do is attach this so that it sits like that, and we want the interfaced one and the interfaced one to both be on the same side of the garment, so that it gets that support that we talked about a little while ago. So I'm going to flip this down, and we're going to pin along these edges here, and you'll find that this fits perfectly in with a 1/2 inch seam allowance down the side. And then I'm going to place my other collar stand right side down onto it so that it is still all curving up that same direction. And then I want to clip and pin all the way around it. So I'm going to start with one edge, and what I like to do with this here is, because we're going to stitch down this side along the top and down the other side, but we don't want to catch this collar. So I like to kind of use a mixture of clips and pins for this bit, and I'm going to pin exactly right next to this so that I can see exactly where I want it to go. Now I know it's better to pin going inwards like that, so that if you accidentally stitch over your needle, you're less likely to catch it. But I want to, for this one here, I want to see exactly where this collar is. So if I pin it right next to it, then I'm not accidentally going to catch it. And then I'm going to do the same thing on the other side, except I'm going to be stitching in the other direction. So I'm going to make my pin go upwards, and then, because I'll be stitching up, along, and then down, and I always want the pin, the head of the pin, to be the furthest bit away from the needle so I can pull it out as I stitch past it. So there, and then I'm going to clip all the way along the top, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to stitch up one side, along the top, and then back down. So if you go ahead and do that now. Alrighty, we are nearly there with this collar. I have stitched the collar stand here to the collar, and what I want to do now is trim these edges so that when it turns through there's not loads of bulk. So I am going to trim both the seam allowance and the corner, and the corners I'm really trimming because I don't want that bulk right there. And then once I've done that, I'm going to turn it through and give it a good press. So go ahead and do that right now. So this is trimmed up now, and I'm going to turn this through here, and as you can see, the interfaced one just does not want to sit flat. So what I'm going to do now is go away and press that, and the goal is to press it and get a really nice crisp edge and corner there like that. That is all nicely pressed now. I really like how that's sitting. And what the instructions say to do now is stitch up and around and along and down the other side to hold this so that it sits nicely in place and that hold that seam allowance down, and then optionally to stitch horizontal lines through there. I haven't decided if I'm going to do that yet. I will have a look and see what it looks like once I've done the actual top stitching. It's completely optional if you want to do those stitching. You could do squiggly lines, you could just leave it. There's absolutely no functional reason for those lines other than we tried them when we were making the tutorial. It's one of my favourite things to do on coats, and it was just a little bit of fun. So do those if you would want to, and then pop your top stitching along the top. In fact, I would do the top stitching along the top first and then the lines, but it is completely up to you. So give it a try and see what you like with your lines and decoration on your collar. To do it because I just can't help myself. I love this horizontal stitching. It is so subtle. I really don't know if you can see that. It's like really subtle, but because I've done it in my top stitching thread is a very similar colour to the light colour on the fabric here. And what I've done is I've stitched around, all the way around. Now there are actually lines on the pattern piece, but I haven't used them. What I've done instead is, as I've lined this up and put it into my sewing machine, I've put my presser foot so that there is the width, that's the edge of the presser foot there. In fact, let me grab it, hang on. Here we go. So as I've put it into the sewing machine, let's pretend I'm putting it in here, and you can see that where this first line is, where the needle comes down, that the edge of the presser foot lines up with this first row of stitching, which is where I've stitched around the collar. And so I've just stitched down like that, stitch, 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 and I'm using the edge of the presser foot against this line here to guide me, so that this here is a really nice parallel first line. And when I got all the way to the end, I went all the way up to this where I have done my top stitching around, and then I turned it, put my needle down, turned it, did about 5 stitches I think it was, put my needle down, turned my fabric again, and then lined up my presser foot again with this one here, and then stitched down. And that's what I did. So I sewed along and then down and then along and then down like that. Now this is not a rectangular pattern piece, so you'll see on the bottom that this is slightly further away from the edge than this is, and I'm okay with that because this is the underneath part of the collar that you cannot see. This is just a nice little detail. You could use the lines on the pattern piece and draw it all out, but that's a faster, easier way of doing it. It just means that it's not quite exactly aligned to the bottom. However, remember that there'll be a 1/2 inch seam allowance, so when we stitch this on, it's going to come here, so you won't see this big gap. You'll just see a little gap between there and the end of the collar. So that is my beautiful collar. I love that now, so excited. So let's attach it. Okay, we're attaching the collar. So I've got myself 1 pin here. I'm going to use a pin, not a clip, and I'm going to fold my collar so that it is in half, and then I'm going to use this pin to, it's hard to look through the camera and do this at the same time. There we go. So I've just placed a pin at the exact halfway point on the on my collar stand, because I want to know exactly where the center of my collar is. And then I've got my garment here, and let's see if I can show you this really clearly. Now the what's it called? Neck hole. Let's pull this around. Here we go. So this is my neck hole here. These are my shoulder seams. This is excuse me, my center back seam, and this is coming around to the front of the garment. So what we want to do is attach the collar here, but right sides together on the other side. I'm just showing you this way so you can see where the seam allowances are and what we're trying to do. And what we're going to do is we're going to be attaching the this center point of the collar exactly to that center back seam, and that's why I use a pin, so that I can get that completely spot on. If you use a clip, because clips are wider, it can be slightly off-centered. And the thing about this collar is that it does not go all the way to the edge. So we're going to be clipping it on. We're not clipping it all the way to the edge of the garment. It's going to go roughly to about there once we clip it on. So it's really important to get this centered on the exact center of the garment. So I'm going to turn it over so that I can actually pin it on now. And remember we talked about having the interfacing, if you've done it, on the underside of the garment. So the interfacing should be the closest part of the collar to the back of the garment, not to where the lining is going to go. So I want to, even though I've got my pin there, I'm just going to have a little peek inside here, and I can see that this side is the interface side, this side is the non-interface side. And remember, we lined it up, so I know that's the interfacing there, and that won't be interfaced on the other side. So if I've got my garment right side up, I want this exactly where it is here. So the interfacing right side up and non-interfaced right side down. And I'm going to line that up there and flip it over so that they are now right sides to right sides. And I'm going to pin this directly into the centre back here. Now we want to use clips or pins for this next bit. And as we have done previously, I'm going to clip all of these little seam allowances so that they stay open. Now, there is no easing of the collar on here. You are just clipping it or pinning it, however, keeping the raw edges matched together. There shouldn't be one that's wavy and one that's flat. You're just keeping them nice and smooth it along with your fingers. Do not pull it in any way, shape or form, or your collar will end up in the wrong place. And then when you get to the seam allowance here for the shoulder, I'm going to clip both parts of the seam allowance to make sure it stays open, and then I'm just keeping it nice and smooth. There's no pulling, there's no waviness, and all the way, there we go, all the way to the end, and there is no change in that. It just stops, and that is then where the collar is going to be, and then this is the part that folds over on the front of you. And so then I'm going to clip it the other way as well. And then what we're going to do is stitch it using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. That means that that will be inside the actual seam allowance of the coat. This is not the seam that's going to hold the collar on forever. It's just there so that it's basting it, so that it's holding it there while we then finish off the rest of the coat. So clip along the other side and then stitch this using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Actually, before you stitch it on, one last little check to do. So you can see I've clipped my collar on all the way around. I've still got my pin in the middle. Since I've now aligned that, I don't actually need that pin anymore. So I'll just take it out, because when I'm sewing with clips, I then forget if I've got pins in sometimes and just run straight over them, which is not very good health and safety. So let me tell you what I'm doing here. This is the centre back here. I'm going to fold it in half here, and I just want to check, given that this doesn't finish at a particular, there's no kind of change in the garment here where it finishes, it just carries on smooth on this edge here. I want to check that I have actually kept this straight, that I have not misaligned it at all. So I folded it bang on that seam, and I just want to check that I've that the collar is finishing at the same place there, and yes it is, and that way I know that I've got half my collar on, half the neckline. So that is now ready to stitch on.